Have you ever been told that Nietzsche was a dangerous thinker, a prophet of chaos, or even an early warning sign of nihilism? Or maybe you've heard Jordan Peterson invoke Nietzsche's name, claiming that he diagnosed the collapse of morality but ultimately failed to offer a real solution? But what if I told you that Peterson's version of Nietzsche is, at best, a misinterpretation, and at worst, a deliberate repurposing of his ideas to fit an entirely different ideological agenda? What if everything you thought you knew about Nietzsche was wrong? Welcome to today's deep dive, where we will unravel one of the most misunderstood intellectual battles of our time: Jordan Peterson versus Friedrich Nietzsche. This isn't just a philosophical debate, this is about how we make sense of the world today. If you feel lost in a time where old values are collapsing, if you've ever questioned the meaning of life in a post-religious world, or if you've struggled with nihilism yourself, then you need to watch this video until the very end. Nietzsche was not just some armchair philosopher ranting about the decline of religion. He saw what was coming. And his ideas are more relevant now than ever before. But Peterson, despite being one of the most well-known public intellectuals of our time, gets him completely wrong. Worse, he uses Nietzsche's ideas to push a message that is the exact opposite of what Nietzsche actually believed. And today, we're setting the record straight. We'll break down how Peterson distorts Nietzsche's concept of value creation, why he misreads the Übermensch as an individualistic self-help figure, and how he completely misses Nietzsche's point about the death of God. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand Nietzsche better, you'll see how his ideas can help you navigate the modern world in ways Peterson never could. So if you're tired of surface-level interpretations, if you want to truly understand the real Nietzsche, and if you're ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about morality, values, and meaning, then stick around. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. And before we get started, take a moment to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep philosophical breakdown like this. Also, if you find value in this content, consider supporting the channel by hitting that super thanks button or checking out the donation links in the description. Every contribution helps us keep making content like this, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. Now, let's dive in. Nietzsche's philosophy is one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented in modern intellectual discourse. Among those who claim to have grasped his ideas, few have wielded his name as frequently and as misleadingly as Jordan Peterson. A psychologist and cultural commentator, Peterson has built a significant following by addressing existential and societal crises, often invoking Nietzsche's warnings about the death of God and the dangers of nihilism. However, his interpretation of Nietzsche is deeply flawed, particularly when it comes to the philosopher's views on morality, value creation, and the concept of the Übermensch. Peterson's reading of Nietzsche is not only oversimplified but, in many respects, completely backwards. To understand why, we must dissect his core misunderstandings and contrast them with Nietzsche's actual philosophy. Peterson frequently describes Nietzsche as an advocate of radical individualism, suggesting that the philosopher encouraged people to create their own values. In Peterson's framing, Nietzsche's project of value creation is synonymous with a kind of subjective moral relativism, where each individual must construct their own moral code from scratch. According to Peterson, this proposition is deeply problematic because it would lead to chaos if everyone simply invents their own values. Society would devolve into a kind of philosophical anarchy where no shared ethical framework exists. This, in Peterson's view, is not only impractical but fundamentally unworkable because humans are not fully rational beings. We struggle to obey even the values we claim to hold, and our inner psychological conflicts mean we cannot simply will ourselves into coherence. He sees this as proof that Nietzsche's idea of value creation is untenable. This interpretation, however, rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of Nietzsche's concept of values. Nietzsche does not argue that individuals should create values in an arbitrary or subjective manner. Rather, he presents a historical and physiological account of how values emerge. In Nietzsche's view, values are not rationally constructed maxims that individuals consciously choose, but expressions of deeper instincts and drives rooted in biology, history, and power dynamics. They are not the result of abstract ethical reasoning but grow organically from the conditions that foster life, power, and vitality. Nietzsche's famous concept of the will to power suggests that all living things, including humans, seek to assert their strength and impose order upon the world in a way that maximizes their potential. Values, in this sense, are not chosen, they are discovered through struggle and lived experience. To illustrate this, consider the transformation of values throughout history. The ancient Greeks, for example, revered qualities like physical strength, beauty, intelligence, and honor. Their moral framework was built around these ideals, which reflected their warrior culture and competitive spirit. In contrast, early Christianity, emerging from a context of oppression and persecution, elevated values like meekness, humility, and self-sacrifice. This was not a rational, conscious choice made by individuals, it was a cultural shift driven by necessity and survival. The Christian moral order did not arise because someone arbitrarily created it, but because it served the psychological and social needs of a particular group at a particular time. Nietzsche calls this process a transvaluation of values, when one set of values is replaced by another due to shifting power dynamics and existential conditions. This brings us to another major flaw in Peterson's reading, his misunderstanding of how Nietzsche views the creation of values. Peterson frames Nietzsche's challenge as an individual task. Each person must invent a new moral system. But Nietzsche does not argue that every individual is capable of or even interested in this kind of philosophical transformation. Instead, he suggests that certain exceptional individuals, lawgivers, artists, prophets, and great thinkers are the ones who shape and redefine value structures. These individuals are not merely reacting to moral decay, they are actively reordering the hierarchy of values based on what they perceive to be life-enhancing and empowering. Nietzsche provides several historical examples of such figures, including Plato, who reoriented Greek values around the pursuit of eternal truths rather than physical excellence, and Jesus, who inverted the traditional Greco-Roman value system by making suffering and humility the highest virtues. Muhammad is another example. He reshaped the value structure of the Arabian Peninsula by establishing Islam as both a religious and political force. In each case, values were not created arbitrarily but emerged through a powerful, sometimes violent, assertion of will. These figures did not simply invent values out of nowhere. They articulated a vision that resonated with their time and circumstances, often in response to a crisis or cultural upheaval. The process of revaluation, then, is not about every individual constructing their own moral code. As Peterson suggests, it is about a historical movement in which new values rise to prominence because they are better suited to the challenges of the time. This is why Nietzsche warns that the death of God, the collapse of the Christian moral order, will necessitate the emergence of a new value structure. If no new values take the place of the old ones, humanity risks falling into nihilism, the condition in which all values lose meaning. Nietzsche feared that modern society, having lost its traditional religious framework, would drift aimlessly unless new, life-affirming values emerged to fill the void. This leads to another crucial misinterpretation in Peterson's reading, his misunderstanding of the Übermensch. Peterson frequently links the concept of value creation to the idea of the Übermensch, portraying this figure as someone who successfully creates their own values in response to the death of God. However, this is not what Nietzsche means by the Übermensch. The Übermensch is not merely a person who invents new values. He is a vision of the future, a potential evolutionary leap for humanity. Nietzsche describes humanity as a bridge, not an endpoint. Just as humans evolved from earlier life forms, we too are a transitional species, and the Übermensch represents what might come next. Nietzsche does not present the Übermensch as an individual goal for every person to strive for. Instead, he argues that human civilization should orient itself toward creating the conditions for the Übermensch to emerge. He contrasts this with the alternative, degeneracy and decline. If humanity fails to rise to the challenge of revaluing its values, it will not remain static, it will regress. This is why he warns against passive nihilism, the tendency to retreat into old belief systems or adopt weak, self-destructive values out of fear and uncertainty. Peterson's focus on the stability of traditional values, then, directly contradicts Nietzsche's call for a radical revaluation. Another flaw in Peterson's argument is his concern that value creation will lead to chaos. He assumes that without a fixed moral order, society will collapse, but Nietzsche never advocates for moral anarchy. Instead, He argues that values must be tested and proven through conflict and struggle. The strongest values, those that enhance life and affirm existence, will survive and dominate. This is not a prescription for disorder but a recognition of how values have always been determined. History is filled with examples of moral frameworks competing for dominance. From the shift from paganism to Christianity, to the Enlightenment's challenge to religious authority, to the cultural revolutions of the modern era, none of these transitions were purely rational discussions. They were conflicts in which one set of values supplanted another. To put this into contemporary terms, consider how different societies today struggle over values. Debates over free speech, gender roles, political ideologies, and economic systems are not settled through abstract reasoning alone. They are contested in the public sphere, in the courts, in the media, and, sometimes, in the streets. The values that survive are not necessarily the ones with the best logical arguments, but those that prove themselves through social and historical forces. Nietzsche recognizes this process and embraces it, while Peterson fears it. Ultimately, Peterson's misreading of Nietzsche serves his broader agenda, defending traditional values against what he sees as the encroaching chaos of modernity. His project is fundamentally conservative. He seeks to restore faith in established moral structures rather than reimagine them. In doing so, he aligns himself with precisely the kind of nostalgic traditionalism that Nietzsche critiques. Nietzsche does not call for a return to old values, he calls for their radical transformation. If we take Nietzsche seriously, we cannot simply retreat into the past. We must confront the challenge of creating something new. This is the great irony of Peterson's reliance on Nietzsche. While he invokes Nietzsche to warn about nihilism, he ignores Nietzsche's actual solution: the necessity of overcoming outdated moral structures and forging new values. Rather than recognizing Nietzsche's call for creative destruction, Peterson clings to a moral framework that Nietzsche saw as exhausted and in decline. By misunderstanding the nature of value creation, the role of historical transformation, and the meaning of the Übermensch, Peterson not only misinterprets Nietzsche, he fundamentally opposes him. Jordan Peterson has often referred to Nietzsche in his lectures and interviews, particularly in discussions about morality, values, and the crisis of meaning in the modern world. However, his interpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy is deeply flawed, primarily because it distorts the concept of value creation, misunderstands the implications of the death of God, and assumes that Nietzsche's insights inevitably lead to social instability. While Peterson correctly identifies Nietzsche as a thinker who saw the erosion of traditional values as a major existential crisis, he misrepresents Nietzsche's solution to that crisis. Instead of engaging with Nietzsche's radical call for the revaluation of values, Peterson frames him as a cautionary figure whose ideas ultimately reinforce Peterson's own advocacy for a return to traditional structures. One of Peterson's most repeated claims about Nietzsche is that the philosopher believed human beings must create their own values. Peterson often presents this as an almost impossible burden, implying that Nietzsche expected individuals to consciously construct an entirely new moral system from scratch. In this reading, Nietzsche's call for value creation is framed as an extreme form of moral subjectivism, where each person is responsible for determining their own ethical framework independent of any external authority. Peterson argues that this notion is unrealistic because human beings are fundamentally constrained by their biology, history, and psychological limitations. He frequently points out that people struggle to live by even the values they already claim to hold, citing examples like procrastination, addiction, and self-sabotage as proof that we are not fully in control of ourselves. If people cannot even adhere to the moral standards they voluntarily accept, how could they possibly succeed in constructing an entirely new value system? To illustrate this point, Peterson often refers to common struggles like dieting, exercise, or personal discipline. He notes that many people set goals for themselves: losing weight, reading more, waking up early, but repeatedly fail to follow through. He sees this as evidence that our own internal subpersonalities are in conflict with each other, making it difficult to act with consistency. From this, Peterson draws the conclusion that Nietzsche's idea of value creation is naive, since individuals are not psychologically equipped to impose a coherent moral order upon themselves. Instead, Peterson suggests that values must emerge from long-standing cultural traditions, developed over centuries through social evolution. He often cites religious morality, particularly Christian ethics, as an example of a system that has withstood the test of time precisely because it is rooted in something deeper than individual willpower. Peterson takes this argument a step further by warning that Nietzsche's model of value creation would lead to philosophical anarchy. If every person is free to invent their own system of morality, then there is no reason to assume that these systems will be compatible with one another. He argues that this would create an environment where people are constantly in conflict. Since their fundamental values would be at odds, Peterson believes that shared moral frameworks are necessary for social stability and cooperation. And he presents Nietzsche's ideas as a direct threat to this order. He describes a world in which individuals, lacking a common ethical foundation, would be unable to coexist peacefully, leading to chaos and even violence. This argument resonates with many of Peterson's followers, particularly those who are wary of what they see as moral relativism and the erosion of traditional values. In his view, Nietzsche's philosophy offers a dangerous precedent, a world where people discard inherited moral traditions in favor of constructing their own personal codes, ultimately leading to fragmentation and disorder. He frequently associates this with the broader cultural trends of secularization, individualism, and the decline of religious belief. Peterson sees Nietzsche's ideas as part of the intellectual current that led to nihilism, Marxism, and postmodernism movements that, in his view, have contributed to the moral disarray of the modern world. Peterson also connects Nietzsche's philosophy to what he calls the crisis of meaning in contemporary society. He argues that the death of God, described by Nietzsche, was not just the loss of religious faith, but the collapse of the entire moral structure that had given people a sense of purpose for centuries. Peterson correctly acknowledges that Nietzsche saw this as a profound existential problem, one that could lead to despair and nihilism. However, Peterson's solution to this problem diverges sharply from Nietzsche's. Whereas Nietzsche called for the creation of new values and the emergence of the Übermensch as a response to the death of God, Peterson instead urges a return to traditional moral structures. He argues that abandoning these structures entirely would be too dangerous, as it would leave individuals unmoored and vulnerable to destructive ideologies. To support this argument, Peterson frequently references historical examples where he believes Nietzsche's ideas, or at least their misinterpretations, led to disaster. He often points to the 20th century, citing the rise of totalitarian regimes as evidence of what happens when societies attempt to replace traditional moral systems with new, self-created values. He suggests that figures like Hitler and Stalin filled the void left by the death of God with their own ideological doctrines, leading to immense suffering. While Nietzsche himself was deeply critical of nationalism and authoritarianism, Peterson implies that Nietzsche's rejection of traditional morality helped pave the way for these developments. Peterson's argument is compelling to those who see modernity as a time of moral uncertainty and social fragmentation. He presents Nietzsche as a thinker who correctly diagnosed the problem but whose proposed solution, value creation, was ultimately unworkable. In Peterson's view, the only viable response to the death of God is to reaffirm and strengthen the moral traditions that have historically provided meaning and order. He frames this as a necessary corrective to the chaos that would result from Nietzschean individualism. However, this interpretation fundamentally misrepresents Nietzsche's actual philosophy. Nietzsche did not advocate for a world in which every individual arbitrarily created their own values in isolation. Instead, he described value creation as a historical process driven by certain exceptional individuals, lawgivers, artists, philosophers who redefined the moral landscape. Nietzsche was not calling for philosophical anarchy. He was recognizing the inevitability of moral transformation. History had already seen major shifts in value structures. Pagan antiquity gave way to Christianity. Medieval theocracy gave way to Enlightenment rationalism, and Nietzsche saw his own era as another turning point. He was not asking the average person to invent a new moral system overnight. He was describing how the process of moral evolution unfolds over time. Moreover, Peterson's claim that Nietzschean value creation leads to chaos overlooks the fact that Nietzsche did not see stability as the highest social good. Peterson assumes that the purpose of morality is to maintain social cohesion, whereas Nietzsche viewed morality as an instrument of power that could either elevate or weaken humanity. The mere fact that a moral system provides order does not make it desirable in Nietzsche's eyes. In fact, He saw many traditional moral systems, especially Christian morality, as life-denying and decadent, promoting weakness rather than strength. Peterson's emphasis on preserving inherited values is directly opposed to Nietzsche's call for their radical transformation. Peterson's concern about human psychological limitations also misses the mark. While it is true that people struggle with self-discipline and often fail to live according to their own stated values, Nietzsche did not expect individuals to rationally construct their own moral systems through sheer willpower. Instead, he saw values as emerging from deeper, instinctual forces. The process of revaluing values was not a conscious, intellectual exercise, it was a natural consequence of changing historical and existential conditions. Peterson presents Nietzsche's ideas as an unrealistic self-help challenge, when in reality, Nietzsche was describing a broader cultural and philosophical shift that would play out over generations. Additionally, Peterson's claim that Nietzschean value creation led to totalitarianism is historically dubious. Nietzsche was one of the most vehement critics of both mass movements and state-imposed morality. He despised nationalism, collectivism, and any ideology that sought to impose a single value system on everyone. Far from endorsing figures like Hitler or Stalin, Nietzsche warned against the dangers of herd mentality and the suppression of individuality. The idea that his philosophy led directly to totalitarianism is not supported by a careful reading of his work. Ultimately, Peterson's interpretation of Nietzsche serves his broader ideological project, defending traditional values against what he sees as the dangers of modern secularism and moral relativism. By portraying Nietzsche as a cautionary tale rather than a revolutionary thinker, Peterson attempts to steer his audience away from radical change and toward a reaffirmation of existing moral structures. However, in doing so, he fundamentally misrepresents Nietzsche's vision. Nietzsche did not advocate for a return to old values, he called for their destruction and the creation of something new. By framing Nietzsche's philosophy as a failed experiment in individual moral construction, Peterson distorts its meaning and obscures its true significance. Jordan Peterson fundamentally misinterprets Nietzsche's concept of values because he assumes that values are primarily ethical principles consciously adopted by individuals. This misunderstanding leads him to believe that Nietzsche was advocating for an unsustainable form of moral subjectivism, where individuals must rationally construct their own ethical framework. However, Nietzsche's actual view of values is far more complex and rooted in physiological, historical, and existential realities. For Nietzsche, values are not abstract moral codes arbitrarily chosen by individuals but rather expressions of deeper biological drives and environmental necessities. They emerge not from intellectual deliberation but from the instinctual and existential conditions that shape human existence. This is where Peterson's reading goes astray. He equates values with a consciously chosen moral system, whereas Nietzsche sees them as deeply embedded in the structure of life itself. One of Nietzsche's core ideas is that values are not static, universal truths but rather dynamic, evolving constructs that arise in response to life's conditions. In The Will to Power, he argues that values are not dictated by some higher rational order but instead reflect the survival and flourishing strategies of a given culture or species. This means that what is considered valuable is not an eternal principle but a product of historical contingencies. A moral system that emerges in one context may be entirely meaningless or even harmful in another. Nietzsche was deeply critical of philosophers and theologians who presented values as if they were absolute and unchanging. Instead, he saw them as fluid and contingent, always tied to the forces of power and survival. To understand this more clearly, consider how different civilizations throughout history have developed their own value systems based on their environment and existential needs. In ancient Sparta, for instance, the highest values were strength, discipline, and collective duty. These were not chosen arbitrarily but were essential for the survival of a militaristic society constantly engaged in warfare. Weakness was not merely frowned upon, it was seen as a direct threat to the integrity of the state. This is why infants deemed physically unfit were left to die. In contrast, the Athenians valued intellectual achievement, debate, and the arts because their society was structured around commerce, philosophy, and political discourse. These two city-states had vastly different value systems, but neither set of values was simply the result of a rational moral philosophy. They were dictated by the conditions necessary for the survival and prosperity of each respective society. This understanding completely contradicts Peterson's portrayal of Nietzsche's view on values. Peterson often presents values as a kind of consciously constructed ethical code, implying that Nietzsche was urging individuals to sit down and decide what they believe is morally right. But for Nietzsche, values are not something one invents out of thin air. They are a natural product of the will to power, the fundamental drive that animates all living beings. The will to power is not simply a desire for dominance, as some misunderstand it, but the basic impulse to assert oneself, to grow, to expand, and to shape the world in accordance with one's nature. This means that values arise from life itself, not from rational deliberation. They reflect the conditions that enable an organism or society to thrive. Take, for example, the transition from paganism to Christianity. In the pre-Christian world, the dominant values of Rome and Greece were based on strength, heroism, and the celebration of earthly power. Gods like Zeus and Mars represented dominion, conquest, and the triumph of the strong over the weak. But when Christianity emerged, it introduced an entirely different value system, one that exalted humility, suffering, and self-sacrifice. Why did this shift occur? Nietzsche argues in On the Genealogy of Morality that this was not because people suddenly realized that humility was a higher moral good, but because Christianity emerged among the oppressed people who lacked political and military power. For those who were powerless, a morality that glorified meekness and suffering provided a psychological advantage. By redefining strength as evil and weakness as virtuous, Christianity reversed the previous order of values and allowed the weak to exercise moral authority over the strong. This was not a philosophical debate won by superior logic. It was a power struggle in which one set of values replaced another because it served the interests of a new dominant group. This historical shift demonstrates how values are not rationally created but evolve through power dynamics and existential necessity. Nietzsche's analysis suggests that moral values are not dictated by a divine law or universal reason but are instead tools used by different groups to assert their place in the world. When the conditions that support a given value system change, the values themselves will eventually change as well. This is why Nietzsche believed that Western morality, built upon Christian values, was in crisis. He saw that the underlying conditions that gave rise to Christianity were disappearing, leading to the erosion of its moral authority. The death of God was not merely the decline of religious belief but the collapse of the entire value system that had structured Western civilization for centuries. Nietzsche recognized that this would inevitably lead to a period of chaos and uncertainty. But he did not see it as a call to return to old values. Instead, he believed that humanity would need to develop new values that reflected the realities of a post-religious world. Peterson, however, does not engage with this historical and existential dimension of Nietzsche's thought. He assumes that values are simply conscious decisions, which leads him to misinterpret Nietzsche's call for a revaluation of values. In Peterson's reading, Nietzsche is telling individuals to invent their own morality as a kind of intellectual exercise. But in reality, Nietzsche is describing a much broader, more profound process, one in which values shift over time due to the changing needs and conditions of human life. Nietzsche was not advocating for arbitrary individual value creation. He was analyzing the historical process by which value systems rise and fall. This is why Peterson's fear of philosophical anarchy is misplaced. Nietzsche was not calling for moral chaos, but recognizing that values must evolve to remain meaningful. To put this in a more contemporary perspective, consider how values have changed in modern society. A few centuries ago, the idea of monarchy as the divinely ordained system of government was almost unquestioned. People accepted that kings ruled by divine right and that obedience to the sovereign was a moral duty. But as political and economic conditions changed, this value system eroded. Democracy and individual rights replaced monarchy as the dominant values, not because people simply decided that democracy was morally superior, but because historical conditions such as the rise of capitalism, increased literacy, and technological progress made democratic values more effective for organizing society. Similarly, attitudes toward gender roles, racial equality, and social justice have undergone massive transformations over the past century. These shifts did not happen because philosophers sat down and invented new ethical systems. They occurred because society's conditions changed, forcing a re-evaluation of values. Peterson's emphasis on stability leads him to reject this natural evolution of values. He sees value systems as something that must be preserved rather than re-examined, which is fundamentally at odds with Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche did not believe in clinging to old values simply because they provided social order. He saw morality as a tool that could either enhance or suppress human potential. And he believed that many of the values inherited from Christianity were weakening humanity rather than strengthening it. For Nietzsche, the goal was not to preserve values for their own sake but to cultivate values that affirm life, creativity, and the expansion of human potential. Peterson's misinterpretation of Nietzsche's concept of values ultimately leads him to misrepresent Nietzsche's entire project. By framing values as conscious moral choices rather than instinctual and historical expressions of life's conditions, Peterson distorts Nietzsche's vision into an impractical, individualistic endeavor. Nietzsche was not telling every person to create their own values in an abstract, intellectual sense. He was describing the inevitable transformation of moral frameworks in response to existential necessity. Values are not the product of philosophical debate but of life itself, shaped by the forces of history, power, and survival. Peterson's failure to grasp this leads him to fundamentally misunderstand Nietzsche's critique of morality and the philosopher's call for a revaluation of values. Jordan Peterson's interpretation of Nietzsche's concept of value creation is deeply flawed because it assumes that Nietzsche believed every individual must construct a unique moral framework from scratch. This reading distorts Nietzsche's actual argument, which is not about arbitrary personal moral invention but about the historical process through which dominant value structures are overturned and replaced by new ones. Nietzsche does not claim that all individuals are capable of revaluating values. Instead, he argues that such transformations occur through the influence of exceptional individuals, figures who reshape the moral order in ways that resonate with the existential needs of their time. These are not everyday people deciding what is right or wrong for themselves but cultural, philosophical, and religious leaders whose vision and power redefine collective morality. Peterson's mistake lies in reducing Nietzsche's insight to an impractical, individualistic exercise, when in reality, Nietzsche is describing a broader historical and cultural phenomenon. The process of revaluation of values is not an intellectual exercise carried out by individuals in isolation. It is a dynamic historical force driven by power, necessity, and existential shifts. Nietzsche emphasizes that moral frameworks are not eternal truths but hierarchies of values that have been constructed over time. At certain moments in history, these value structures collapse or become obsolete, necessitating the emergence of new values. But crucially, this process is not democratic or universal. It is driven by a small number of transformative figures who impose a new order of meaning upon society. Nietzsche often points to figures like Plato, Jesus, and Muhammad as examples of such revaluators. Each of them dramatically reshaped the moral landscape of their civilizations by introducing new conceptions of virtue, morality, and truth that displaced previous systems. Plato, for instance, initiated a radical transformation of Greek values by shifting the cultural focus from honor, heroism, and physical excellence characteristic of Homeric Greece to an abstract, rationalist moral order centered on the pursuit of eternal truths. His philosophy redefined notions of justice, virtue, and the good, paving the way for the development of Western metaphysics and Christian moral thought. This was not a case of individuals sitting down and deciding to adopt new ethical principles through conscious deliberation. It was a seismic cultural shift led by a philosophical visionary whose influence endured for millennia. Similarly, Jesus introduced a complete inversion of the Greco-Roman moral hierarchy. In the classical world, power, strength, and conquest were celebrated as virtues, while weakness and suffering were seen as undesirable. Jesus' teachings, later institutionalized by Christianity, reversed this order, elevating humility, meekness, and self-sacrifice as the highest moral goods. This was not a simple matter of people choosing new values. It was a fundamental reordering of the moral universe, one that Nietzsche critiques extensively in On the Genealogy of Morality. He sees this shift as a triumph of what he calls slave morality over master morality, a revaluation driven by the resentment of the oppressed, who, lacking political or military strength, sought moral superiority through suffering and renunciation. Muhammad's role in reshaping values follows a similar pattern. Pre-Islamic Arabia was a tribal society organized around honor, kin loyalty, and vengeance. Muhammad introduced a unifying religious and legal structure that subordinated tribalism to a singular moral and spiritual vision. This was not merely a new set of ethical prescriptions but a radical transformation of what was considered valuable and just. Like Plato and Jesus, Muhammad did not create values in the sense of inventing them from nothing. Rather, he reordered the existing moral hierarchy, elevating some values while diminishing others. This historical pattern contradicts Peterson's claim that Nietzsche was calling for every individual to personally construct a new morality. The revaluation of values is not a subjective, individualistic process. It is a social and historical transformation enacted by powerful and influential figures. Nietzsche does not expect the average person to become a moral legislator. In fact, he explicitly states that most people are not capable of this task and will always follow the moral frameworks imposed upon them. The majority of humanity, according to Nietzsche, is conditioned by centuries of inherited moral assumptions and lacks the creative strength necessary to challenge and reshape those assumptions. Another critical error in Peterson's interpretation is the assumption that Nietzschean value creation happens ex nihilo, out of nothing. Peterson presents Nietzsche's idea of value creation as though it implies a kind of moral relativism where anything goes. As if people could wake up one day and decide that courage is bad and cowardice is good. Or that truth no longer matters. But Nietzsche does not believe that new values are randomly invented. They emerge from the transformation of existing hierarchies. Revaluation is about shifting the ranking of values, not arbitrarily replacing them. A clear historical example of this can be seen in the French Revolution, which was not an invention of entirely new values but a dramatic reordering of the moral and political landscape. The revolution did not create justice, liberty, or equality out of nothing. These concepts had existed for centuries in various forms. What changed was their position in the moral hierarchy. Under the ancient regime, the divine right of kings, aristocratic privilege, and religious authority were paramount. The revolution subverted this hierarchy, elevating the rights of the individual, popular sovereignty, and secular governance as the new moral foundation of society. This was a Nietzschean revaluation in action, not the spontaneous invention of moral principles but a radical shift in the prioritization of values. The same dynamic can be observed in the transition from paganism to Christianity in the Roman Empire. Pagan Rome was structured around a set of values that emphasized honor, power, and civic duty. Christianity did not introduce the idea of compassion or mercy. These concepts already existed, but it elevated them above strength and conquest, fundamentally altering the moral fabric of Western civilization. This was not the result of individual Romans sitting down and deciding to adopt a new moral code. It was a sweeping cultural transformation led by a religious movement that ultimately reshaped the world. Nietzsche's understanding of value creation is deeply historical and psychological. He does not describe it as a rational, individual choice but as a process driven by existential necessity and power struggles. Peterson's misunderstanding stems from his focus on the role of the individual in moral decision-making, whereas Nietzsche is concerned with the larger forces that shape moral evolution. This is why Nietzsche's critique of morality is not about rejecting structure or order but about recognizing when an inherited moral system has become obsolete. He saw Western morality, shaped by Christianity and Enlightenment humanism, as entering a period of decline because it no longer aligned with the realities of human existence. The death of God signified the collapse of the metaphysical foundation that had supported these values for centuries, necessitating a new revaluation. Peterson's response to this crisis is fundamentally conservative. He argues that we should reaffirm traditional values to prevent the descent into nihilism. He views Nietzsche's call for new values as dangerous because he assumes it leads to moral chaos. But Nietzsche does not advocate for chaos. He describes the necessity of transformation. If old values no longer serve life, they must be reevaluated not through arbitrary individual choices, but through the emergence of new hierarchical orders forged by those capable of leading such transformations. In modern terms, we can see this process happening in real time. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed numerous moral revaluations, civil rights movements, the shift in attitudes toward gender and sexuality, and the growing emphasis on environmental responsibility are all examples of values being reordered to reflect new existential realities. These changes are not occurring because individuals are randomly deciding to adopt new ethical frameworks. They are emerging through cultural struggles, historical developments, and shifts in power structures. Nietzsche understood that values are shaped by necessity and power, not by rational prescription or personal choice. Peterson's reading of Nietzsche reduces a grand historical process into an unrealistic burden placed on individuals. By misunderstanding how values actually emerge and change, he distorts Nietzsche's vision and presents it as an impractical form of subjective moral invention. But Nietzsche was not urging people to simply decide their own morality. He was describing how values are contested, overturned, and reshaped through history. The revaluation of values is not a solitary act but a societal and existential transformation. Peterson's fear of this process reflects his commitment to preserving inherited moral structures. Whereas Nietzsche saw such structures as transient, always subject to the forces of life and power, Jordan Peterson's argument that if individuals were to create their own values, society would collapse into chaos is based on a misunderstanding of how values actually function within societies. He assumes that without a fixed moral order, people will be unable to cooperate, leading to conflict and instability. However, Nietzsche does not propose a world where everyone randomly decides their own moral system. Nor does he suggest that moral structures arise purely through rational agreement. Instead, Nietzsche views morality as a battleground of competing value systems, with dominant values emerging through struggle, conflict, and historical necessity. Societies do not operate on the basis of pre-agreed moral principles so much as they reflect the outcome of power struggles in which one system of values asserts dominance over another. This directly contradicts Peterson's claim that shared morality is necessary to prevent societal collapse. Nietzsche argues that value systems are always in flux and that competition between them is not only inevitable but essential for the evolution of human culture. Peterson frames morality as a stabilizing force that prevents chaos. But Nietzsche sees moral structures as instruments of power, not as mechanisms for social harmony. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche criticizes the assumption that morality exists to ensure peace and cooperation. Instead, he describes it as a tool used by different groups to impose their worldview. The rise and fall of moral systems are not determined by logical debate but by existential struggles in which one set of values prevails over another through its ability to assert itself. This process is neither inherently good nor bad, it is simply how values are established and maintained. Societies do not remain stable because they have a universal moral code, they remain stable because the prevailing moral code has successfully defeated its alternatives. A clear historical example of this dynamic can be seen in the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Rome's value system was not the result of collective moral agreement but of conquest, political consolidation, and military dominance. The Roman Republic was built on values such as duty, honor, and loyalty to the state, which were enforced not through rational persuasion but through institutional power and the might of the Roman legions. As Rome expanded, it imposed these values on the territories it conquered, often through sheer force. Local customs and moralities were subordinated to Roman law, and those who resisted were either assimilated or destroyed. This was not a voluntary adoption of shared moral principles, it was the assertion of one moral order over another through power. Peterson's claim that societies function because individuals voluntarily agree on a moral structure is refuted by history, which shows that dominant values emerge not through consensus but through struggle. The same pattern can be seen in the Ottoman Empire, which imposed Islamic law and governance over vast and diverse populations. The Ottoman system did not arise from a universal moral agreement but from the military and political success of the Ottoman ruling class. The values of the empire structured around religious authority, hierarchical governance, and military expansion were not debated into existence. They were established through conquest and maintained through institutional control. When rival value systems threatened Ottoman authority, they were suppressed. The eventual decline of the empire was not due to a breakdown in shared morality but to shifts in power that made the existing value structure untenable. The United States provides another example of how values are imposed rather than agreed upon. The American Revolution did not occur because British and American colonists engaged in a philosophical discussion and decided to part ways. It was a violent struggle in which one set of political values triumphed over another. The foundational values of American democracy, individual liberty, constitutional rights, And free market capitalism did not emerge through rational consensus but through revolution, war, and economic dominance. Even within the United States, value conflicts have played out through struggle rather than consensus. The Civil War was not settled through moral agreement. It was a violent clash between two fundamentally opposed value systems. The civil rights movement did not succeed because white and black Americans sat down and rationally agreed on a new moral framework. It succeeded because activists, through persistent struggle, forced the existing system to change. Nietzsche understands this reality and explicitly rejects the idea that moral values can be sustained through agreement alone. He argues that all moral structures are contingent on power and that their survival depends on their ability to assert themselves. Peterson, by contrast, fears that the competition between value systems will lead to social breakdown. But Nietzsche sees this competition as the very mechanism that drives human progress. Without the struggle between values, societies stagnate. When Nietzsche speaks of the revaluation of values, he does not mean that individuals should invent their own moralities in isolation. He means that outdated value systems will inevitably be challenged and replaced by stronger alternatives. The ability of a value system to survive is determined not by its inherent truth but by its ability to assert itself in the world. This view directly contradicts Peterson's claim that moral relativism leads to anarchy. Nietzsche acknowledges that different people and cultures will have conflicting values. But rather than seeing this as a threat, he sees it as an unavoidable and even necessary condition of existence. Societies do not crumble because people hold different values. They evolve through the confrontation of competing values. The history of civilization is a history of moral contestation, in which dominant values emerge through struggle and adaptation. Peterson's fear of moral instability ignores the fact that all moral systems, including those he defends, are the result of previous conflicts between rival ethical frameworks. Moreover, Nietzsche's perspective reveals that no moral system is permanent. Every civilization that has ever existed has seen its value system change over time, often through processes of violent upheaval or gradual transformation. The medieval Christian order, which governed Europe for centuries, did not collapse because people suddenly decided to reject it. It collapsed because economic, political, and intellectual forces rendered it unsustainable. The Enlightenment did not emerge from a consensus among European thinkers. It emerged from a series of radical disruptions that upended the previous moral order. The notion that a single moral framework can provide permanent stability is contradicted by history, which shows that moralities rise and fall according to their ability to maintain power. Peterson's attachment to moral stability is ultimately rooted in a conservative impulse to preserve traditional values rather than to understand how they evolve. He presents Nietzsche's philosophy as dangerous because it undermines the idea that morality must be fixed and universally agreed upon. But Nietzsche is not advocating for chaos. He is simply describing the reality of moral transformation. Societies do not remain stable because everyone shares the same values. They remain stable because dominant values have successfully imposed themselves through historical processes. When those values become untenable, they will be replaced, not through intellectual debate, but through existential necessity. A modern example of this process can be seen in the ongoing shifts in global values. The rise of secularism in the West has not occurred because people rationally decided to abandon religion. It has occurred because scientific, economic, and cultural forces have made religious explanations of the world less compelling. The expansion of LGBTQ+ rights has not been the result of pure rational persuasion but of cultural and political struggle. The increasing emphasis on environmental responsibility has not emerged from philosophical agreement but from the material realities of climate change forcing societies to reconsider their priorities. These are Nietzschean revaluations in action, shifts in value hierarchies driven by power, necessity, and historical change. Peterson's misreading of Nietzsche leads him to believe that a competition between value systems would result in societal collapse. But Nietzsche sees this competition as the engine of human history. Societies do not function because everyone agrees on moral principles. They function because certain moral principles have asserted dominance over others through power, struggle, and adaptation. Peterson's belief that a fixed moral order is necessary for stability ignores the fact that all moral orders are historically contingent and subject to change. Nietzsche does not advocate for moral anarchy, he simply recognizes that values are always in flux and that their legitimacy is determined not by consensus but by their ability to endure and impose themselves upon reality. Ultimately, Peterson's fear of moral instability is based on a misunderstanding of how societies actually operate. He assumes that shared morality is a prerequisite for order, whereas Nietzsche argues that order is always a temporary outcome of power struggles between competing value systems. The history of civilization is a history of revaluation, in which new values replace old ones not through mutual agreement but through existential and historical necessity. Peterson's concern that Nietzschean revaluation leads to chaos fails to recognize that chaos is already built into the process of cultural transformation. Values do not persist because they are agreed upon. They persist because they prove themselves strong enough to endure. Nietzsche sees this as an unavoidable reality, whereas Peterson resists it, hoping instead to cling to inherited moral frameworks in an attempt to preserve order. But history does not preserve order indefinitely, it moves. It shifts, and it transforms. Just as Nietzsche predicted, Jordan Peterson fundamentally misinterprets Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, reducing it to the idea of a self-actualized individual who independently creates values. In doing so, he distorts Nietzsche's vision of a broader evolutionary process that is not about personal self-improvement but about the transformation of humanity itself. Peterson's misreading turns the Übermensch into an individualistic psychological project rather than the philosophical and existential ideal that Nietzsche actually proposed. Nietzsche never suggests that any one person can become the Übermensch in their lifetime. Instead, he presents it as a distant goal, something that humanity as a whole must move toward by overcoming itself. The Übermensch is not merely a strong-willed individual who takes charge of their own morality, as Peterson often suggests, but a new form of being, one that transcends the limitations of current human nature and value systems. Peterson often frames Nietzsche's Übermensch as a self-sufficient, hyper-disciplined person who rises above the herd and forges their own path through sheer willpower. This interpretation aligns with Peterson's broader emphasis on personal responsibility and self-discipline, which he sees as the antidote to chaos and nihilism. In his view, the Übermensch is an individual who does not rely on traditional moral structures but instead constructs their own framework of meaning and purpose. He frequently ties this idea to his broader message about finding meaning in suffering, taking responsibility, and resisting ideological conformity. While these themes may resonate with Nietzschean language, they fundamentally misrepresent what Nietzsche actually meant by the Übermensch. To understand Nietzsche's actual concept, it is essential to examine its context within Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In the book, Zarathustra, a prophet-like figure who serves as Nietzsche's mouthpiece, announces the coming of the Übermensch as a response to the death of God. The death of God signifies the collapse of traditional values, leaving humanity in an existential crisis. Without a divine authority dictating morality, mankind faces two choices: either descend into nihilism or create new values that affirm life. However, Nietzsche does not present the Übermensch as a solution that individuals can personally embody. Rather, it is a vision of what humanity might become if it successfully revaluates its values and transcends its current limitations. This is why Zarathustra does not tell his followers to become the Übermensch. Instead, he urges them to live dangerously, to embrace struggle and hardship, and to reject the passive comfort of old moral systems. The Übermensch is not a specific person but a future possibility, a goal for humanity as a whole. Nietzsche explicitly states that mankind is something to be overcome, implying that the Übermensch is not simply a better version of a human but something entirely beyond humanity as we know it. Just as humans evolved from lower life forms, the Übermensch represents the next stage of evolution, not in a biological sense, but in a philosophical and existential one. This distinction is crucial because it directly contradicts Peterson's framing of the Übermensch as an individual project. If Nietzsche had meant for people to become the Übermensch in their own lifetime, he would have described it as a personal transformation, something achievable through self-discipline or psychological strength. But instead, he describes it as a future development, something that requires the destruction of existing value structures and the cultivation of a new way of being. Zarathustra repeatedly emphasizes the importance of going under, of sacrificing oneself for the sake of something greater. This is not an individualistic journey of self-improvement, it is about contributing to the conditions that will allow the Übermensch to emerge. To illustrate the difference between Nietzsche's actual concept and Peterson's misreading, it is useful to compare the Übermensch to similar ideas in other philosophical traditions. For example, in Buddhism, the bodhisattva is an enlightened being who chooses to remain in the cycle of suffering to help others attain enlightenment. The bodhisattva is not simply a highly disciplined or wise person but represents a state of being beyond ordinary human existence. Similarly, Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, describes the highest state of being a person can achieve. However, Aristotle does not frame eudaimonia as something any person can reach through sheer will. It requires a specific social and educational structure that cultivates virtue over generations. The Übermensch is more radical than either of these ideas because it does not seek to perfect humanity within its current form but to push it beyond its existing framework entirely. While Aristotle's eudaimonia is still rooted in human nature, and the bodhisattva still operates within the cycle of samsara, the Übermensch transcends humanity itself. This is why Nietzsche repeatedly uses imagery of destruction and rebirth in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Übermensch is not just a more disciplined or independent person, it is an entirely new way of being. One that emerges only when humanity overcomes itself. Peterson's misinterpretation also leads him to miss Nietzsche's critique of individualism as it is commonly understood. While Nietzsche celebrates strong individuals, he does not advocate for an atomized, self-sufficient existence. He consistently argues that humans are shaped by their cultures, histories, and instincts, and that true transformation requires more than just personal willpower. The Übermensch is not a solitary figure carving out a moral code for themselves, it is the product of a broader cultural transformation. This is why Nietzsche is so critical of modern individualism, which he sees as a shallow rejection of tradition without any substantive revaluation of values. Simply rejecting traditional morality does not make someone an Übermensch, they must also create something new and life-affirming in its place. A modern analogy would be the difference between someone who simply rebels against societal norms and someone who genuinely reshapes culture in a meaningful way. Many people today reject traditional religion, authority, or social conventions, but this rejection alone does not constitute a revaluation of values. It is one thing to tear down old structures, it is another to build something new in their place. Nietzsche criticizes both the passive followers of tradition and the nihilistic rebels who reject all values without replacing them with anything meaningful. The Übermensch is not just a person who rejects old values, it is the embodiment of a new order of meaning. Another important point that Peterson overlooks is Nietzsche's distinction between the Übermensch and what he calls the last man. The last man is the opposite of the Übermensch, a being who seeks comfort, safety, and the avoidance of struggle. The last man represents the stagnation of humanity, the endpoint of a society that prioritizes security over greatness. Nietzsche feared that in the absence of traditional values, people would not rise to the challenge of creating new ones but would instead retreat into mediocrity. The Übermensch is not merely an independent thinker, it is a response to the dangers of complacency and cultural decline. Peterson's emphasis on personal responsibility aligns more closely with Nietzsche's warning about the last man than with his vision of the Übermensch. If anything, Peterson's advocacy for maintaining traditional values as a safeguard against nihilism is precisely the kind of passive conservatism that Nietzsche saw as an obstacle to true transformation. Ultimately, Peterson's misreading of the Übermensch reduces Nietzsche's radical vision into a self-help philosophy that encourages individuals to take charge of their own lives. While personal responsibility is certainly important, it is not what Nietzsche was talking about. The Übermensch is not a person who masters their own psychology, it is a future possibility for humanity. Something that can only emerge through a complete transformation of values. By misunderstanding this, Peterson not only distorts Nietzsche's message but also weakens the power of his critique. Nietzsche was not offering a roadmap for individual self-improvement, he was challenging humanity to surpass itself, to create something entirely new rather than clinging to the old. Peterson, in his desire to preserve traditional values, ends up reinforcing the very mindset that Nietzsche sought to overcome. Nietzsche is often misunderstood as a thinker who advocated for chaos and the destruction of morality. Many, including Jordan Peterson, portray him as a radical individualist who sought to dismantle all existing structures without offering anything in their place. However, Nietzsche was not a nihilist in the sense of rejecting all meaning. His critique of morality was not about promoting anarchy but about strengthening humanity. He believed that traditional values, particularly those derived from Christianity, had become life-denying and restrictive, preventing human beings from reaching their full potential. His call for the revaluation of values was not a call for moral collapse but for a stronger, more life-affirming system of meaning. Nietzsche saw the death of God not as an event to be celebrated or mourned, but as an existential challenge that demanded a creative response. When Nietzsche declares that God is dead, he is not simply making a statement about the decline of religious belief. He is pointing to the collapse of an entire moral framework that had structured Western civilization for centuries. Christianity had provided a foundation for morality, giving people a sense of purpose and meaning. However, as scientific progress and philosophical skepticism eroded the credibility of religious faith, this foundation began to crumble. Nietzsche saw this as both a crisis and an opportunity. Without God, humanity was left without an external source of moral authority. This did not mean that people would suddenly become immoral or lawless, but that the values that had been taken for granted would lose their justification. The real danger was not that people would reject morality outright, but that they would cling to the remnants of a broken system, pretending it still had meaning when, in reality, it had already lost its foundation. Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity was not about its ethical teachings in themselves but about the psychological and existential effects of those teachings. He argued that Christian morality promoted weakness by glorifying suffering, humility, and self-denial. While these values may have been useful for early Christians who were often oppressed and powerless, Nietzsche believed they had become harmful once Christianity became dominant. Instead of encouraging strength, ambition, and creative power, Christian morality taught people to suppress their instincts and to see their natural drives as sinful. This, for Nietzsche, was a form of life denial. It led people to reject their own potential in favor of an abstract ideal that valued obedience and passivity over growth and self-overcoming. This critique extends beyond religion. Nietzsche saw the moral structures that emerged from Christianity, including Enlightenment humanism and liberal democracy, as continuing this legacy of life denial. Even secular moral systems, he argued, retained the Christian emphasis on equality, pity, and the suppression of instinct. The problem, in Nietzsche's view, was not morality itself but the particular kind of morality that had come to dominate Western thought. He believed that if humanity was to grow stronger, it needed to move beyond these inherited moral constraints and develop new values that affirmed life rather than negating it. Nietzsche did not believe that the death of God automatically led to freedom. In fact, he warned that without a new source of meaning, people would fall into nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent purpose. He saw nihilism as the greatest threat to modernity, not because it led to immorality, but because it led to despair. If traditional values were no longer credible, and no new values were created to replace them, people would become passive, aimless, and ultimately resigned to meaninglessness. This is what Nietzsche feared most: a world in which people, instead of rising to the challenge of creating new meaning, simply gave up and retreated into comfortable mediocrity. This concern is strikingly relevant to the modern world. Today, many people struggle with questions of meaning and purpose in a secular age. With traditional religious belief in decline, existential questions about why we are here and what we should value become more pressing. This is evident in the widespread cultural obsession with self-help, mindfulness, and personal growth. Many turn to philosophy, psychology, or spirituality to fill the void left by religion. Others seek meaning through political ideologies, social movements, or even consumerism. Nietzsche anticipated this search for meaning, but he also warned against easy solutions. He criticized those who replaced religious belief with equally dogmatic secular ideologies, arguing that true value creation required more than simply swapping one rigid system for another. Nietzsche's alternative to nihilism was the idea of self-overcoming. Instead of passively accepting inherited values, he believed people must actively create their own meaning. However, this was not the kind of individualistic value creation that Peterson describes. Nietzsche did not believe that each person could simply invent their own morality in isolation. Rather, he saw value creation as a cultural and historical process, driven by exceptional individuals who challenge and reshape existing moral structures. The Übermensch, in this sense, is not just a person who takes responsibility for their own life but a symbol of humanity's potential to transcend its limitations and create a new vision for the future. To understand Nietzsche's perspective, it helps to look at historical examples of value transformation. One of the most dramatic shifts in values occurred with the transition from the Roman world to the Christian era. In pagan Rome, strength, honor, and dominance were the highest virtues. The gladiatorial games, military conquest, and political power were celebrated as expressions of human excellence. But with the rise of Christianity, these values were reversed. Humility replaced pride, meekness replaced strength, and suffering was elevated as a path to spiritual greatness. This was not simply a philosophical change, it was a fundamental reordering of the moral hierarchy. Nietzsche saw this as a victory for slave morality over master morality, a shift that, in his view, prioritized weakness over vitality. A similar transformation took place during the Enlightenment. The authority of the Church was challenged, and new values emerged based on reason, individual rights, and scientific inquiry. This was another Nietzschean revaluation, in which old moral assumptions were questioned and replaced with a new framework. However, Nietzsche was skeptical of the Enlightenment's ability to provide a lasting foundation for morality. He believed that secular humanism, despite its rejection of religious dogma, still carried the psychological baggage of Christianity. The emphasis on universal human rights, equality, and compassion, he argued, was a continuation of Christian morality in a new form. This is why Nietzsche saw the death of God as more than just the end of religious belief. It was the beginning of a much deeper crisis in which all inherited values had to be re-examined. In the modern world, we see new forms of revaluation happening all the time. Movements for social justice, changes in attitudes toward gender and sexuality, and debates over economic and political systems all reflect ongoing struggles over values. Nietzsche would likely view these conflicts not as signs of decline but as necessary tensions that drive cultural evolution. He did not advocate for a return to any specific set of values but for a continual process of questioning and reordering. He believed that the greatest danger was complacency, the belief that the moral questions of the past had been settled and that no further transformation was necessary. Nietzsche's call to create new values is not a call to destroy morality but to refine it. He believed that morality should serve life, not suppress it. The challenge he presents is not one of rejecting all values but of finding those that enhance strength, creativity, and the flourishing of human potential. This is why he admired figures like Goethe and Napoleon, individuals who, in his view, embodied a higher form of life affirmation. He did not see them as moral relativists but as people who lived with intensity, purpose, and vision. The question Nietzsche leaves us with is how to move forward in a world without fixed moral absolutes. If old values have lost their authority, what should take their place? His answer is not a simple one. He does not offer a step-by-step guide to meaning but instead challenges us to engage with life fully, to confront uncertainty with courage, and to embrace the struggle of self-overcoming. This is not a comfortable or easy philosophy, but it is one that remains profoundly relevant. In a time when many feel lost in a world without clear meaning, Nietzsche's challenge is as urgent as ever: to reject passive nihilism, to resist easy answers, and to take responsibility for shaping the future of human values. Jordan Peterson has built much of his intellectual reputation on the idea that Nietzsche warned of the dangers of nihilism and the collapse of traditional values. While this is partially true, Peterson distorts Nietzsche's philosophy to fit his own ideological framework. Rather than engaging with Nietzsche's radical challenge to morality, Peterson repurposes his ideas to argue for a return to traditional values, portraying Nietzsche as a cautionary figure rather than a revolutionary thinker. This misrepresentation serves Peterson's broader agenda of reinforcing conservative moral structures, rather than embracing Nietzsche's call for the creative destruction and revaluation of values. Peterson's use of Nietzsche is strategic. He acknowledges the death of God as a profound crisis but argues that the solution is to preserve as much of the old value system as possible. He frequently warns that abandoning traditional morality will lead to chaos, fragmentation, and the rise of destructive ideologies. However, Nietzsche does not argue for the preservation of old values. He argues that the moral order built on Christianity and Enlightenment humanism is already collapsing under its own weight. Holding onto it out of fear is not a solution, it is a form of intellectual and existential cowardice. Peterson presents himself as someone who helps individuals find meaning in a secular age. Yet he fundamentally rejects Nietzsche's solution, the bold creation of new values rather than the desperate clinging to old ones. Peterson's mistake is in assuming that order is always preferable to transformation. He treats the competition of values as a threat, while Nietzsche sees it as the driving force of human evolution. Peterson worries that without a shared moral framework, society will descend into anarchy. But Nietzsche recognizes that no value system lasts forever. The history of civilization is a history of values being overturned and replaced through conflict, crisis, and revaluation. Christianity did this to the values of the Roman world. The Enlightenment did this to the values of medieval Christendom. And now we stand on the edge of another great transformation. Nietzsche challenges us not to retreat into the past but to face this transformation head-on. To become active participants in shaping the future rather than passive inheritors of outdated moral structures. Understanding Nietzsche correctly is not just an intellectual exercise, it has practical implications for how we navigate the modern world. We live in an era where traditional moral frameworks are rapidly eroding. Religious faith is in decline. Political ideologies are increasingly polarized, and many people struggle to find meaning in a world without clear moral absolutes. Nietzsche's insights can help us understand why this is happening and, more importantly, how we should respond. His philosophy does not offer easy answers, but it does offer a challenge to embrace the uncertainty of life, to take responsibility for our own values, and to recognize that meaning is not given, it is created. If we truly accept Nietzsche's philosophy, how should we live? This is the question that remains unanswered, not because Nietzsche failed to provide a response, but because his philosophy demands that each individual answer it for themselves. Unlike Peterson, who seeks to guide people back to traditional structures, Nietzsche asks us to move forward into the unknown. This is not a comfortable proposition. It requires rejecting complacency, questioning deeply held beliefs, and confronting the terrifying freedom of a world without fixed moral certainties. But it is also an opportunity. If the values of the past are failing, we have the chance to create something new, something that affirms life rather than denying it. Something that celebrates human potential rather than suppressing it. The lesson to take from Nietzsche is not that all values are meaningless, but that we must have the courage to create values that truly serve us. This means resisting the urge to fall into nihilism but also resisting the temptation to retreat into comforting illusions. It means understanding that meaning is not found, it is forged through struggle, creativity, and the will to power. It means recognizing that morality is not about obedience but about life itself, about growth, strength, and the pursuit of greatness. This is not a call for destruction for its own sake, nor is it an endorsement of individual moral relativism. Nietzsche does not advocate for chaos but for a reordering of values that better reflect the needs of human life. He sees the death of God as an immense challenge but also as a chance to build something greater than what came before. If we take Nietzsche seriously, we cannot simply turn back to old moral codes out of fear. As Peterson suggests, we must take on the responsibility of shaping the future. So the real question is, what comes next? If we accept that old values are failing, how do we create new ones? If we can no longer rely on external authority to give our lives meaning, how do we cultivate meaning from within? Nietzsche does not give us a simple answer, because no single answer exists. Each of us must engage in this process of revaluation, of questioning, of seeking a higher path. Some will retreat to the comfort of old structures, afraid of the void that Nietzsche describes. Others will embrace nihilism, believing that without God, nothing matters. But those who truly grasp Nietzsche's philosophy will take a different path. They will see this moment of crisis as an opportunity to build, to grow, and to create. This is where Nietzsche remains as relevant as ever. In an age of existential uncertainty, his philosophy forces us to confront the truth. Meaning is not handed to us, it is something we must construct. Values are not eternal, they are tested, contested, and transformed through history. Strength is not found in submission to tradition, but in the courage to move beyond it. The question Nietzsche leaves us with is not, how do we preserve the past, but how do we shape the future? To those who seek meaning in an age without certainty, Nietzsche offers no comforting illusions, only a challenge. Do we have the strength to accept it? So, now that we've exposed Jordan Peterson's misinterpretation of Nietzsche, where does that leave us? If Peterson's answer to the collapse of morality is simply to cling to the past, while Nietzsche's answer is to create something new, which one do we choose? More importantly, which one do you choose? The truth is, Nietzsche didn't just criticize morality for the sake of tearing it down. He wasn't a nihilist who wanted to destroy, meaning he wanted to create a stronger, more life-affirming foundation for humanity. He knew that without God, without the old religious structures, we would be lost unless we took responsibility for shaping the future. He wasn't telling individuals to just make up their own rules, he was challenging us to think bigger, to create values that actually serve us, rather than blindly obeying outdated systems of belief. But Peterson? He fears change. He fears the unknown. Instead of embracing Nietzsche's call for transformation, he retreats into the safety of tradition, warning that if we abandon old values, society will fall into chaos. But history has already proven Nietzsche right. Values have always changed. Every great civilization has redefined its moral order. Christianity overthrew the values of the Roman Empire. The Enlightenment overthrew the values of medieval Europe. And now, in the modern world, we stand on the edge of another great transformation. So ask yourself, are you ready for that transformation? Are you willing to engage with Nietzsche's challenge to embrace the freedom and responsibility of living in a world where we must create our own meaning? Or will you cling to the past, hoping that the old moral structures will somehow hold together just a little longer? Nietzsche leaves us with a challenge, not an answer. He doesn't tell us what to believe, he tells us to be strong enough to face the uncertainty of existence without easy solutions. That's not an easy path, but it's the only honest one. And that leaves us with one final question. If you truly understood Nietzsche, how would you live your life differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Peterson's interpretation of Nietzsche? Do you think Nietzsche's ideas are still relevant today? Do you struggle with nihilism in a world without fixed values? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your take. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We have more deep dive discussions like this coming up. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. If you want to support the channel and help us keep making content like this, hit that super thanks button, or check out the donation links in the description. Every bit of support helps keep these conversations going, and I truly appreciate all of you. And if you made it this far, I just want to say thank you. You are part of a rare group of people who are willing to challenge conventional wisdom, to think deeply, and to explore ideas that most people ignore. That alone puts you ahead of the game. Now, go out there, live dangerously, think boldly, and never stop questioning. Until next time.